The battle for supremacy between the North American aviation F-86 Sabre and the Mikoyan and Gurevich MiG-15 can trace its beginnings to a modest internal design study started by North American's management in November 1944. The success of their Mustang had been a two-edged sword for the company. On one hand, they were cranking out the fighters at a furious rate and reaping the profits of their ingenuity. On the other, their importance to the war effort meant that the firm was not being considered as a potential supplier of jets to the US Army Air Force. So North American funded their own study, mating their straight laminar flow wing to a cylindrical fuselage containing a jet engine. This study would eventually attract the attention of the US Navy, who would commission it as the FJ-1 Fury on the 1st of January 1945. Not to be outdone, the Army Air Force commissioned the closely related XP-86 on May 18, 1945. 6,000 miles away in Moscow, comrades Mikoyan and Gurevich could not have started from a more different place than their competitors in Los Angeles. As the in-house OKB of Aircraft Factory 1 in Moscow, they had inherited a high-profile position in 1939. They did not, however, succeed in doing much with it in the piston-engined era. Their MiG-1 and MiG-3 were flawed aircraft, and although about 3,500 were made, they were not popular with pilots. Lavochkin and Yakovlev were the fighter pilot's choice in the Great Patriotic War. But that lack of success meant that Mikoyan and Gurevich had time on their hands when the time came for the Politburo to consider development of a jet fighter. So in February 1945, the MiG OKB started development of what would become the MiG-9. Like the Fury, it was also straight-winged, but in this case was powered by a pair of copied Jumo 004 turbojets. The MiG-9 wasn't a particularly good design, but it was the first Soviet jet fighter to be mass-produced and to appear in public. Early progress with the MiG-9 meant that MiG were a front-runner when the Ministry of Aircraft Production launched a process to develop a swept-wing, high-altitude fighter capable of 620 miles an hour in March 1947. The wing was a 35-degree swept aerofoil design captured from the Germans and refined at the Central Hydrodynamics Institute, or SAGI. MiG could have modified the MiG-9 to take this wing, but instead elected to take its lessons and start from a clean sheet of paper. The first prototype of the MiG-15 flew on the 30th of December 1947, powered by a Rolls-Royce Nene centrifugal turbojet. In the US, the North American Aviation Design Team had also been made aware of the 35-degree Arrow wing via Operation Paperclip. This was convenient timing as the XP-86 project was in serious trouble. With a straight wing, it couldn't meet the US Army Air Force's minimum speed requirements, which was set at 600 miles an hour. Unbeknownst to the Air Force, North American management self-funded a project to fit the Arrow wing to the XP-86 in August 1945, thus completing the bones of the Sabre. After much detailed development, the XP-86 finally flew for the first time on the 1st of October 1947, only a couple of months before the MiG-15. Engine development problems with the J-47 meant that the Sabre didn't enter service until February 1949. The first MiG-15s weren't with squadrons until July of that year. Having been developed in complete isolation from each other, and having followed quite different paths to completion, it's perhaps surprising that the Sabre and the Faggot are apparently so similar. But looking beyond the superficial configuration of a single turbojet fed by a prominent nose intake, 35-degree swept wing and single tail, reveals a different story. For simplicity of comparison, I'll start with the MiG-15 BIS, which form the majority of the Faggots deployed in Korea, and the F-86A5 through A7. Turbojet power was obviously fundamental to both aircraft. The MiG was powered by a Klimov VK1 centrifugal motor. It was 2.6 meters long with a maximum diameter of 1.3 meters. It weighed 822 kilograms and it produced 5,955 pounds of force for a thruster mass of 3.1 to 1, if you'll forgive me mixing my units. North American Aviation went another route with the Sabre. It was powered by a General Electric J47GE3 axial flow turbojet, which gave 5,500 pounds of force from a 1,150 kilo or 2,500 pound package. Thrust to mass was therefore about 2.25 to 1. The J-47 was 3.7 meters long and it had a diameter of 93 centimeters. In other words, J-47 was nearly 50% longer than the RD-45 or VK-1, but 25% slimmer at its widest point. This leads to the Sabre being 37 feet long, whereas the MiG is just 33 feet long. Interestingly, the Sabre also has a wider fuselage at 1.6 meters versus 1.35, despite the narrower engine. Sabres carried 437 gallons of fuel in their tanks versus 380 in the MiG. But whereas the Sabre's fuel was split between the fuselage and the wings, the Faggot had all its fuel in the fuselage. Both aircraft could carry a pair of drop tanks under wing. When doing so, their ranges were essentially identical at 1,500 miles of ferry range and 400 miles of combat range. Where both the non-suffix MiG-15 and the BIS had a clear advantage over the early Sabre was in climb rate. The MiG's thrust loading was 0.54 versus about 0.4 in the F-86A. In a straight line, the slower response of the MiG's centrifugal motor meant that instant acceleration was about the same, but then the MiG would ease out ahead. Up front, the two aircraft's armament layout reflected very different ideas about how fighters should be armed and deployed. On the basis that high fire rate, high muzzle velocity, and a flat shell trajectory was judged to be essential for a fighter engaging other fighters, the Sabre carried 6 50 caliber Browning M3 machine guns in the sides of its nose. With 1,500 rounds on board, the total installation weighed about 765 pounds, and it laid down 1.4 pounds of shells every second. The MiG-15's armament setup was totally different, consisting of a pair of 23mm cannons and a single 37mm. These were initially NS-23 and later NR-23 23mm weapons, and NS-37 later NR-37 37mm. In the later BIS models with the updated cannons, the battery weighed 898 pounds with 40 rounds of 37mm and 160 rounds of 23. It put down a mighty 14.8 pounds of metal on target every second, and each shell was explosive. The cost of this fire weight was low rate of fire, 20% lower muzzle velocity, and comparatively poor shell ballistics. The 37mm cannons in particular had a tendency to launch their shells in lazy arcs. This reflected Soviet pilots' behaviors during the Second World War. They preferred to get in extremely close and deliver a devastating hit from a range at which ballistics and shell velocity were of little importance. As initially delivered, both aircraft were fitted with gyro gun sights, although as I'll get to shortly, the Sabre soon moved on to an advanced radar-directed sight that significantly improved accuracy and lethality. The MiG's gun sight was poorly calibrated so that if a pilot aimed where the sight said, he would fire a stream of 23mm shells above the target and a stream of 37mm shells below it. Some Soviet pilots simply gave up on the gyro sight, painted marks on the windscreen, and used those to aim. Another famous difference between the types was in cockpit ergonomics. The Sabre was well laid out and well finished. It had powered controls and a light stick. Just as important, the canopy was a clear bubble with no frames to get in the way. The MiG also had a raised canopy, but lack of experience blowing plexiglass or similar materials meant that it had heavy frames at the front, running front to back directly above the pilot and running across the canopy behind him. The controls were unassisted and heavy, to the point that some pilots welded extra tubing on the top of the stick to provide greater leverage at high speeds. The ergonomic differences arguably had more impact on the combat effectiveness of the two types than any of the other differences. As John Boyd would famously notice, the Sabre pilot had better situational awareness, could react faster to the things he noticed as the controls were light, and he could keep doing those things for longer because he would get less tired. These advantages would deepen when the F-86E appeared, equipped as it was with a powered, all-flying tail. Onto the wings. The Sabre's wings were based on the ME-262's Arrow wing, and they were 35.2 degrees swept along the leading edge. They were fitted with mechanical flaps that automatically extended as the airspeed dropped to provide better low-speed control. The MiG's wing was designed by Sagi, based again on German research. Of course, one major difference is that the MiG's wings are mid-mounted with a 2-degree anhedral, whereas those of the Sabre are at the base of the fuselage and have a slight dihedral. The wing shapes are more subtly different too. To manage the centre of gravity, the aft section of the MiG's wing root is straight. The Sabre's sail-like wing has a higher aspect ratio. it inherently resists spanwise flow better than that of the MiG. Less of the wing surface ends up being blanked as transonic speeds are approached, thus allowing control to be retained for longer. The MiG's aerofoil required prominent fences to delay the point at which spanwise flow stalled the wingtips. Another critical difference is rather harder to see. The thickness of the Sabre's wings skins tapers perfectly towards the tips. Cruder machining in the Soviet Union meant that although they were aiming for something similar, they rarely got it right. The result was that the MiG-15's wings were generally very slightly asymmetric, which led to sudden and unpredictable wing dip as speed climbed towards the sound barrier. This made diving the faggot an act of faith. More ergonomic things against it. In sum, the MiG had a total span of 33 feet for a wing area of 222 square feet. The Sabre was larger, with a 37-foot span and 299 square feet of area. Wing loading was therefore about £53 per square foot in the £15,000 Sabre versus £49 in the £11,000 MiG. The theoretical turning benefits of this were basically eliminated by the heavy controls of the MiG, and the two fighters were very similar in a pure turning engagement. Out back, the Sabre's horizontal tail is also low-mounted. The MiG's tail is higher up the vertical fin. The upshot of the aerodynamic configurations was that the Sabre was 11 miles an hour faster at sea level, 679 miles versus 668, but at 35,000 feet the tables were turned and the MiG was 24 miles an hour faster than the Sabre's 601 miles an hour. The MiG-15 was a utility industrial product that, once good enough, was produced in vast numbers. 9,300 were made in the Soviet Union, of which two-thirds were the BIS. The Sabre, on the other hand, was a commercial success story for North American aviation, who were perhaps the most entrepreneurial of the immediate post-Cold War aviation manufacturers. Because of this and the enthusiasm of the USAF for innovation, there were many versions of Sabre, even if we don't count the dogs and hogs, which were Sabres only for Congress-pleasing reasons. The most important variants to talk about in terms of career are the E, which introduced the all-flying tail and standardized the A1CM radar ranging gun sight, and the F. Pilots in the early Sabre squadrons had been quick to report that the aircraft felt strange to fly in the transonic regime around Mach 1. The controls seemed to reverse, so that if the pilot wanted to pull up, then the aircraft would continue to go down. The controls weren't actually reversing, of course, they just weren't responding effectively because at high speeds the airflow over the elevators prevented the hydraulically boosted circuits from moving them. The aircraft would just carry on going where it was going. The solution was to fit an all-hydraulic system that did away with the cables. It was much stronger and it could easily overcome the additional forces. Although they had now regained control over the aircraft, it still felt sluggish. This was because the combination of stabilizer and elevators was right for the size of aircraft, but the elevators were too small to give enough control response in transonic flight. The North American engineering team went back to the drawing board again, redesigning the entire operation of the tail so that the stabilizer and the elevators moved together. In effect, this created a larger elevator surface without changing the physical dimensions of the control surface. The famous all-flying tail was a major breakthrough. Its only drawback was that it removed direct connection between the control stick and the surfaces. Pilots didn't like this. Once again, the engineers came up with an ingenious solution. They used a system of bungee cords and counterweights to create a primitive force feedback system, giving artificial feel to the pilot. The Sperry A1B gun sight had been introduced on the F-86A5. It incorporated an AN/APG-5C ranging radar to automatically acquire targets and calculate lead. Although relatively crude, it filled the empty space above the engine intake, and when it worked, it gave improved accuracy. The last few of the A5 batch had the vastly improved Sperry A1CM gun sight, based around the AN/APG-30 radar. This unit had a sweep range of between 150 and 3,000 yards. It automatically locked on and tracked targets, projecting the lead pipper on the armoured glass windscreen. Although a brilliant system when it worked, it wasn't flawless. Below 6,000 feet of altitude, it tended to get confused by returns off the ground. The radar, which was a complex mix of temperamental valves assembled by hand, could be finicky and unreliable. When it failed, there was no fixed sight as a backup. But in general, it gave the Sabre, which was already a better gun platform than the MiG, an even greater advantage. This was accentuated by its fundamentally more accurate, if much less potent, machine guns. Although the E-model Sabre was now decisively superior in a turning fight, the MiG-15 was still faster accelerating and faster in the climb. This advantage went away with the F-model Sabre. It fielded a new variant of the J-47, which gave 6,090 pounds of thrust. Top speed climbed, but moreover, ceiling was pushed up to 52,000 feet, bringing the Sabre much closer to the MiG-15. More significant was the boost to climb rate, which went up from 7,800 feet per minute to 9,850. This took away another MiG advantage. Sabre pilots could now close on the Soviet fighter in a climb. Remarkably, the more powerful engine also had better fuel consumption. The final point to note on the F was that the sophisticated but fragile A1CM sight was replaced by a simpler, more rugged, and just as effective unit called the A4. Appearing in numbers in the middle of 1952, even the MiG-15 bis was outclassed in everything except service ceiling. Later, the 6.3 wing version of the F model would essentially eliminate even this advantage, eliminating the leading edge slats to reduce drag and extending the wingspan to improve high altitude performance came at a cost of higher landing speed but was judged well worth it. In Moscow, the Mikoyan and Gurevich OKB had long since finished developing the MiG-15 by this point. Factories were beginning to churn out the faster MiG-17, and development of the MiG-19 was in its early stages. The Fresco, however, would never come to Korea. Comparing the jets on paper is fun, but as we're all aware, the pilot in the cockpit was arguably more important in this era, particularly in the first 2 years of the war. The Soviets were the first to operate swept-wing fighters over the peninsula, starting on the 1st of November 1950. Since there were no MiG-15 units on the Chinese or Korean borders in early 1950, and none could be spared from Eastern Europe, the air units selected for Korean deployment did not come from frontal aviation. Instead, they were initially drawn from PVO interceptor units around Moscow. This resulted in some of the most elite units in the Soviet Air Force being assigned to Korea. The 151st Guards Fighter Aviation Division would be the first to fight. It had been formed in 1949 from 3 distinguished units, the 72nd, 28th, and 139th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiments. At that time, a MiG-15 interceptor regiment numbered 35 to 40 aircraft, and a division usually included 3 regiments, giving it a nominal strength of about 120 aircraft. Of these, 28th GIAP was the most experienced unit. Most of the officers were aces, with the best scorers having 10 kills or more. Their jet experience was more limited, amounting to about 40 to 60 hours on the MiG and some time in the Yak-15. 72nd GIAP were air defense specialists. About 70% of the pilots were Great Patriotic War veterans, and they had between 30 and 50 hours on jets on average. A slow start to the jet era in the Soviet Union meant that there weren't many jets to go round, even for elite units. 139th GIAP were the least experienced of the 3 regiments. Only half the pilots were veterans, the rest being post-war recruits. Overall, the average pilot in the 151 IAD had between 350 and 500 hours of flying time, of which 150 to 200 hours was in combat. Ages ranged from 25 to 35, and the average rank was senior lieutenant. The only weakness in the formation was lack of jet time. This lack of experience with a new era of air warfare told in their early experiences. For the only time in the war, the Soviet aviators enjoyed both technology overmatch and the element of surprise. The 151st therefore only did reasonably well, claiming about 40 kills against a mix of F-80s, F-51s and B-29s. There were 2 tactical reasons for this, which are worth bearing in mind when comparing Sabre to Sabre. First was the distance from their bases to the combat zone, exacerbated by a lack of drop tanks. This meant that the Soviet pilots were always a bit low on fuel, and to save the tanks they were instructed not to jettison them and therefore maneuver encumbered. The second factor was a lack of adequate radar coverage, which meant that Soviet pilots had to patrol at high altitude, often in poor weather, looking for targets. Although the veterans of the early Soviet intervention could deal with this, the callow youths that came later were less comfortable when shorn of their ground controllers. Their lives got a lot harder when the first Sabre unit appeared. The 4th Interceptor Wing was hurriedly dispatched to the war zone shortly after the Faggot first appeared. Like their Soviet adversaries, the 4th was an elite unit. Many World War II aces were in their ranks, and even the average pilot had about 600 hours of jet experience. Moreover, their training emphasized fighter-on-fighter combat more than bomber interception. They arrived with a good sense of how to use a fast jet to fight a fast jet. The main issue they had was numbers. With only about 18 aircraft initially available, rising to 70 by the end of the winter, the fourth were rather under strength. The first engagement between the two types occurred on the 17th of December 1950. It was fought at 26,000 feet and resulted in no losses on either side. The first victory on either side was on the 22nd of December. It was a 4-on-4 engagement fought near the Yalu River. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, leading a flight from the Rocketeers of the 336th FIS, had been briefed about the MiG's tactics. The Soviet aviators liked to approach at high altitude, then dive on their opponents before zoom climbing away. So Hinton decided to set a trap. He set up his formation flying at 300 knots, pretending to be an F-80 or F-51 flight. Shortly after 10 a.m., a flight from the 72nd GIAP took the bait. They dove on what they thought was the trailing pair of F-80s from 35,000 feet. Hinton's formation spotted them coming and broke into a defensive turn. As the MiGs leveled out to shoot, the Sabre pilots rammed the throttles forward and went into a spiraling climb. Whether by accident or by design, this was a hard maneuver for the MiG pilots to follow. Their aircraft were not overly stable in high-speed rolls, and the heavy controls were harder to manipulate under G-load. One of the MiGs, piloted by the most junior pilot, Lieutenant Kharitonov, duly overshot and attempted to dive to separate. Hinton rolled inverted and dived to follow. Rapidly closing the distance, he fired a 1.5-second burst from a range of 600 feet at 24,000 feet of altitude, hitting the MiG in the right wing root. The Soviet fighter burst into flames. Kharitonov ejected, but died of his wounds. The other MiGs used their superior acceleration and climb rate to escape back over the border. As I've said, the MiG was a faster climber than the early Sabre, and it could operate comfortably at 50,000 feet. The Sabre topped out at about 45,000, so the MiG flights could pick and choose when to engage. Early on, the Sabres would sometimes attempt to climb up and attack, losing energy and disadvantaging them in the subsequent dogfight. The tactic of remaining high up was most effective close to the border, where the Soviets enjoyed GCI coverage and they could spot the Sabre formations early. Even if they had the element of surprise, though, discipline was essential. 151's pilots were ordered to make one pass only and then to separate. Early on in the fighting, MiG flights began to employ a great patriotic war tactic called the kleshi, or pincers. In this, a formation of four would split into two elements, with the trailers 2 kilometers back at high altitude. The Sabres would often spot the leaders and dive to engage, allowing the trailers to accelerate and attack from behind. This worked to start with. Then the Sabre squadrons learned to wait and look for the second pair, which they could then attack. In general, though, for the MiGs at least, getting involved in a turning fight below 35,000 feet was to give the Sabre pilot the advantage. Its larger, lighter control surfaces, greater stability, and superior visibility were major advantages in a medium or low altitude fight. The Sabre pilots also quickly noticed that the MiG pilots were unwilling to dive their aircraft steeply, a result of the MiG-15's unpredictable transonic behavior. The Soviet pilots' relative lack of jet experience also told in these early fights. Gun camera film shows that they misjudged closure rates and they failed to lead targets sufficiently. The US pilots shot more accurately, but they were frustrated by the M3 machine gun's lack of hitting power. They would often need to shoot off most of their rounds to kill a MiG. This was not a problem for their enemies. 1 or 2 hits from a 37mm cannon or a dozen from the 23mm would cause catastrophic damage to a Sabre. Losses were generally light on both sides during the first 3 months. Part of this was because both sides were feeling each other out. Part of it was that there were small numbers on both sides, meaning that the chances of an engagement were relatively low. Much of it was down to the awful winter weather on the peninsula. There were only 50 or so encounters a month. Early on, both sides realised that the similarities between their aircraft could be confusing in a dogfight. US squadrons therefore painted black and white or black and yellow stripes on their aircraft for identification purposes. But then, just as 151 were beginning to acclimatise, they were withdrawn. The division was exhausted and many pilots did need a break. Soviet collectivism meant that rather than switching pilots in and out, they would move the whole unit. More than anything else, this unit rotation was responsible for the asymmetric results achieved by Sabre and MiG units. So the 151st were withdrawn. They handed over their MiGs to the Chinese People's Volunteers Air Force, marking the first transfer of combat-ready jets to Chinese pilots. They were replaced by the 324th IAD in April 1951. On paper, this was an upgrade. The 324th Air Defense Division was the elite of the elite, commanded by Colonel Ivan Kozadub. With 62 victories, he was the top Soviet ace of World War II. Due to the pilot's celebrity status, Stalin personally ordered him not to fly combat missions. In practice, although the new unit had more jet experience than 151 had when they'd arrived, they had no idea what they faced on the peninsula. Their pilots were seasoned, but meaningfully younger and less experienced. Only about 40% of them were patriotic war veterans. The average age was 23 to 27. Although their jet time was an average of 60 to 90 hours, overall flight hours were only about 300. They were interceptor pilots trained to work with GCI. When they engaged the Sabres, they stuck to the tight line abreast Zveno formation. The Sabres had by this point adopted a fluid 4. If they could get into a good position and bounce the Sabres, then the concentrated firepower of 8 23mm and 4 37mm cannons from close range was devastating. But coordination was key, and the less combat-ready 324 aviators needed time to assemble. The Americans were canny, and they learned how to disrupt the Soviet plan through better positioning and early engagement. Whereas 151 IAD had managed to fight more or less to parity with the US, 324 only managed a loss rate of 1 to 2 against the Sabre in a tour that lasted until January 1952. They were, however, successful in driving B-29s from Korean skies. Their massed, regiment-sized attacks proved impossible for Sabres to hold off, as they couldn't engage the MiGs at high altitude and they couldn't prevent them diving through the formations. It was during this period that Chinese aviators joined the fight. The first A5 model Sabres with the A1CM gun sight also began to appear in the spring of 1951, followed by the E with the all-flying tail in the summer. Although the MiG still had better raw performance, the Sabre's maneuverability advantage was now quite considerable. Its accuracy as a gun platform also took another notch upwards. There were also now roughly twice as many aircraft available to the US wings. 200 Sabres were in theatre by July, of which about 160 were combat capable of any one time. The more experienced of the Soviet pilots did still score kills. As ever in this era, it was those with a natural eye for shooting that did the best. If the MiG's cannons could be mastered, then they were lethal, and they totally outranged the Sabre. Major Dmitry Oskin shot down the World War II ace, Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Eagleston, on the 20th of May 1951 in a single diving pass. He opened fire at 800 metres, or 2,600 feet, scoring at least one hit on the tailplane with his 37mm cannon. Eagleston was forced to eject. Major Alexander Carve shot down an F-86A from the 51st on the 9th of September 1951 from 900 metres. Despite it being a high deflection shot, he scored hits on the Sabre's wing route and Captain John Bolt ejected from his stricken fighter. But in general, the American aviators were able to turn their new capabilities against a new and inexperienced enemy. As it happens, training Chinese aviators had been the initial mission for Soviet units located in the People's Republic. Although some Chinese pilots had flown against the nationalists, their pilot pool was not large. Hero of the People's Republic of China Wang Hai became an ace in Korea, by his estimation at least, and eventually led the entire PLAAF. His recollections of his training in late 1950 are interesting. The vast majority of pilot candidates were drawn from infantry regiments. For example, the 3rd Fighter Aviation Brigade was drawn from the 209th Separate Infantry Division. Its former commander, Gao Huliang, became the commissar of the new fighter brigade, which was soon renamed as a regiment on Mao's order. The aviation regiment's commander, Fang Ziyi, had graduated from a Soviet flight school in China during 1942. But Gao was a long-time veteran who had taken part in the Long March and fought the Japanese with a rifle. None of this made him any way suitable to command a fighter formation, but he did anyway. The vast majority of recruits and officers had similarly politically reliable qualities, but they were not pilots. They had all done 30 hours of training in Yak 11s before being let loose on jets, but that was about it. Training in the MiG-15 consisted of 3 months of flight basics, followed by 2 months of combat technique, including intercepts in pairs and full flights, then full regimental formations. One-on-one dogfighting was taught, as were photo reconnaissance techniques. It was an impressively intense course, with recruits rising at 5 a.m. 7 days a week without stopping for public holidays. On average, a graduate had 57 hours of flight time. The most experienced had 74 hours, the least had 45. Wang Hai proudly states in his memoirs that by this point they had mastered the MiG-15 and combat tactics. Their regiment was therefore ready for action on the 25th of April 1951. Unfortunately for them, by the time that they were in action, they were facing the cream of US pilots. When we come to kill ratios, the combination of declining experience levels in the communist pilots and technical development of the Sabre combined to result in the tipping of the balance heavily in the Allied favour by the end of 1951. Before the dreaded ratios, we need to talk quickly about the North Koreans. North Korean pilots were mostly very inexperienced. Even the few pilots that had flown Yak 9s and IL 10s in the first couple of months of the war had only basic Soviet training to fall back on. The next generation were even greener. Soviet pilots reported receiving groups of 18 and 19-year-olds direct from the North Korean equivalent of aviation clubs. A few of the senior pilots had flown for the Japanese and were much more capable, but they were rare exceptions. Although many had natural aptitude, the average North Korean pilot was by far the least well trained and experienced on the peninsula. This was a significant factor in the outcomes they achieved with the MiG-15, irrespective of the quality of the aircraft itself. By the end of the war in 1953, the KPAF had 3 regiments of MiG-15s on strength for a total of about 90 aircraft. MiG numbers on the peninsula fluctuated. Between November 1950 and February 1951, there were about 120 MiGs available. This grew to between 300 and 350 by the summer, and to between 400 and 450 by December 1951, as Chinese units began to be made operational. Peak numbers were achieved in September 1952, when there were between 500 and 600 aircraft in theatre, with about 100 operated by a single North Korean division. Numbers then declined to about 450 by the armistice. The MiGs were most active in the autumn and winter 1952 as mass night attacks by the B-29s picked up. Soviet aviators flew about 2/3 of the overall sorties. Sabre numbers were always lower than MiG numbers, a feature of other global priorities for the USAF and a lack of space on the local bases given all the other aircraft operating over the peninsula. Having started with a mere 18 planes, numbers grew to 90 by the end of February 1951. They were basically stable for some months, and then they grew to about 150 planes in December 1951 as the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing was fully deployed. Numbers kept growing, with 200 Sabres by June 1951 and 240 at the time of the armistice. Many of those were the hard-winged F model, and by that point in time, the Sabres had essentially achieved complete air superiority despite the disparity in numbers. Availability rates fluctuated, falling as low as 72% in the spring of 1951, but climbing as maintainers got more experienced and bases improved. The best rate was achieved in December of 51, when it hit 87% availability, despite the bitter winter. Availability rates are, of course, influenced by a wide range of factors, but quality and location of bases are 2 of the major ones. They also have an impact on how many missions aircraft can fly in a given day, how tired the pilots are when they arrive, and how much fuel they have. Korea is a relatively small peninsula, and once the front line stabilised after UN forces pushed the Chinese army back, the distance from either side's bases to the main area in which fighter combat took place was pretty short. The 4th FIS were based at Kimpo, about 175 miles from the Yalu. The 51st were at Suwon, about 200 miles away. Suwon was a rather better facility than Kimpo. The 51st moved to Osan towards the end of 1952, about 210 miles from the Yalu. Depot maintenance was generally at Taegu, and pilots could rotate back to Japan for a rest. All of the US airstrips were fully paved. They had modern refueling and maintenance facilities and radar to cover the immediate surrounding areas. Despite having the radars, they weren't fully proof against the bed-check Charlie biplanes that the North Koreans sent over to drop mortar bombs and grenades on parked aircraft some nights. That aside, better bases meant that US availability rates were substantially better than Soviet ones. Equipped with drop tanks, the Sabres had about 40 minutes of patrol time in MiG Alley. Over time, the USAF created an impressive tactical air control system to direct the Sabres. Part of this were 4 C-47 Skytrains modified as radio relays. One of these aircraft also was assigned to work with Navy fighters. By 1952, the Sabre squadrons had a pretty comprehensive view of when MiGs were getting airborne and they could get into a good tactical position. The pilots did, however, have to manage their fuel very carefully. The border was a good 150 miles south, and if they spent too long in combat, they might not make it back. In that case, the best option was to head for the coast. The presence of the Navy and of extensive search and rescue infrastructure meant that with a bit of luck, a pilot could eject over the water and be picked up by a Dumbo after a matter of minutes in his dinghy. The MiGs had numerous bases. Since the UN pilots were strictly forbidden to cross the Yalu, the communists based themselves safely across the border. Antung was the main base for the Soviet divisions and some of the Chinese ones. It had a hardened runway, GCI, and repair facilities. Only 10 miles from the Yalu, it was a matter of a few minutes flying time away. Dapu, 25 minutes from the border, was the alternate base. There was also a network of crude dispersal fields from which Russian aircraft occasionally operated. Chinese aircraft were much more frequent users, and the dusty, poorly surfaced fields drove their operational accident rate up, such that as many of their MiGs would be lost from crashes around the bases as were lost in combat. The GCI radar network covered an arc from Dandong to Anshan, primarily to protect the HQ at Shenyang. The radar also allowed detection of B-29 raids, defending against which was a primary mission of the MiGs. Excessively tight GCI control was a feature of communist operations, particularly as less experienced and more easily directed units joined the fray. Although being close to the battle area is an advantage in some respects, it also made the MiG squadrons rather predictable. The Sabre units learned to set up kill boxes between 10 and 20 miles south of the Yalu to ambush the MiGs as they climbed out. In combination with GCI, which didn't always or in fact often see Sabres lurking at lower altitudes, there were times that US pilots had a field day against enemies who appeared to do nothing to defend themselves. But if GCI was cooperating and the pilots knew what they were doing, then a MiG flight could swoop down on an unsuspecting Sabre unit, hit them hard with the big cannons, and be back across the river in safety within a minute. They needed to be quick, as later in the war, US aviators almost certainly began to risk disciplinary action by attacking MiGs in the landing pattern at Antung and Dapu. Those kills didn't count, but the pilots knew they'd bagged themselves a communist. Most of the fighting, of course, took place in MiG Alley, an area roughly 60 miles north to south and 40 miles east to west, located between the Yalu and Chongchon rivers. Because of the location of the communist bases, this box had to be crossed by their aircraft to access the front lines further south, and was thus the ideal place for the UN forces to engage them. UN fighter bombers and other strike aircraft also liked to roam around this area to attack troop concentrations, rail and road infrastructure, and generally interdict communist operations. The local geography also made it easy for the UN aircraft to navigate using the coastal plain and river valleys as reference points. The weather over the Yalu was often relatively clearer than elsewhere, and the Soviets had established good radar coverage so their GCI controllers could direct the battle. MiG Alley was therefore a curiously good place for both sides to engage in fighter-on-fighter combat. The Korean War is quite unusual in that regard, as it's more usual for the battle area to favour one side over the other. 80 to 90% of the jet fighter encounters took place in that 2,400 square mile area. I think that's enough preamble. In the war's aftermath, the US claimed that Sabre shot down about 792 MiGs for the loss of 78 Sabres. That gave a convenient 10 to 1 kill ratio. Although it wasn't much published at the time, the Soviets had a different version of events. They claimed 692 Sabres shot down for the loss of 335 MiGs, to give a 2 to 1 ratio in their favour. The Chinese claims started out with an imprecise hundreds of Sabres at the time, but in 1985 this was resolved to 211 aircraft in total and 90 Sabres. They acknowledged the loss of 224 MiGs, the majority to Sabres, for a ratio of a bit worse than 1 to 2. North Korea claimed 65 Sabres. Their actual losses are harder to establish. The communist claims are of course quite amusing in hindsight. They essentially claimed that every Sabre ever deployed to Korea was shot down. US claims were accepted for a long time, until communist archives began to open up after 1991 and some better data could be obtained. So what actually happened? US losses are easier to figure out. The official line remains that 78 Sabres were shot down by MiGs. What that doesn't count are aircraft that were hit by fire from MiGs in a dogfight, managed to escape, and then crashed on their way back to base. There are also some instances in which the official assessment says that a Sabre was hit by ground fire, and the communist records say that the damage was actually inflicted by a MiG. Count all of these extra aircraft, and one comes to a number somewhere around 100 Sabres shot down by MiGs. On the communist side, the Soviet numbers can be established with some certainty. 319 Soviet MiGs were determined to be shot down by Sabres. Chinese losses are much harder to determine, but they were probably around 70 or 80. The majority of their overall losses were due to operational accidents caused by inexperienced pilots. Data on North Korean losses is based entirely on defector estimates. There were only a small number of North Korean MiGs operating, and only in the later stages of the war. 20 to 25 losses is generally accepted as a good estimate. So overall, we get to about 400 MiGs shot down for 100 Sabre losses, and a ratio of 4 to 1 in the US favour. This is still excellent, but it's a little less crazy than 10 to 1. Does that mean that a shooting war between the US and the Soviet Union would have turned into a massacre in which the US would have rapidly established air superiority? In a word, no. In the first 6 months of the war, roughly 60 or 70 MiGs were engaged with the same numbers of Sabres, when availability rates were taken into account. Although the US aviators had more hours in their aircraft, their overall combat experience was about the same as the Soviets. The A-5 Sabre was basically equivalent to the MiG-15. Both had strengths and weaknesses. Engagements were small, with maybe 8 or 12 aircraft aside. Like battles in a European war, the MiGs were directed by the GCI base at Antung, whereas the Sabres relied on their leaders on the spot. In this period, 20 MiGs were shot down for 13 Sabres, giving a ratio of about 1.5 to 1 in the Americans' favour. After this period, the ratio skewed further and further against the communists as experienced US units fought new batches of inexperienced Soviet, Chinese, and to an extent North Korean aviators, each achieving less than the last. The US practice of rotating out the pilots when they got to between 100 and 120 missions, but leaving most people and their commanders in place, paid dividends. In an all-out war, though, everyone would be engaged. Although US pilots had more jet hours and more hours overall, there will be plenty of green pilots on both sides. Throughout the history of aerial warfare, the inexperienced die at a high rate. To give you an example, in April 1952, Colonel Gabi Gabreski and his wingman encountered a mixed 16-ship MiG formation of Soviet and Chinese pilots at 40,000 feet. It was 2 against 16, so instead of turning to fight, Gabreski executed a rolling scissor dive to separate the enemy formation vertically. The inexperienced MiG pilots followed him individually rather than maintaining mutual cover. Gabreski then bided his time and picked off one MiG as it overshot, its pilot unable to control his aircraft as his controls had stiffened at high speed, and then he got another one as it tried to climb away too steeply. He and his wingman were then able to disengage. A year later, on the 12th of April 1953, Captain Joseph McConnell's flight of 4 F-86Fs was bounced by 6 MiG-15 Bisses from above. Rather than breaking upward, McConnell ordered a split S into a dive. The Chinese pilots followed, but lacking control near transonic speeds, some of the MiG pilots experienced wing drop and 2 of them overshot. McConnell reversed hard left and climbed back up behind them. He fired a short burst from 700 feet, hitting one MiG, which promptly exploded. Moments later, another MiG pulled too hard, stalled, entered a flat spin, and the pilot ejected. In war, basic mistakes can very easily be terminal. Soviet and Chinese doctrine kept putting inexperienced pilots into the maelstrom. Even on the US side, there was a feeling that some of the replacement pilots sent to the theatre were less than enthusiastic about going into combat. Tactics were also imperfectly communicated from experienced pilots to the new guys. These issues led to Boots Blessé writing No Guts, No Glory, one of the great fighter tactics manuals. Anyhow, based on the outcomes achieved in Korea, my assessment is that the F-86A was broadly equivalent to the MiG-15 when flown by equally skilled pilots. I think that's a generally accepted way of seeing it. From the E model onwards, the Sabre was clearly the better air superiority fighter, although the MiG's heavy firepower and high altitude capabilities made it the better bomber interceptor. Greater experience with jets made the best US pilots marginally superior to the best Soviet ones, but that advantage was smoothed out by the better coordination that the Soviets had with their GCI. Going strictly on claims, 6 of the top 10 aces in Korea were actually Soviet, but given overclaiming on both sides, the actual truth is essentially impossible to establish. So with that uplifting review of my own analysis, I think it's time to finish the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is a bit of a retro subject. Those who have been with me from the very start will recall that the channel began with a rather less detailed version of this story. Hopefully, this has resolved any lingering issues related to the pulling of legs with bells attached. Thanks so much for watching.